War does not end the moment the guns fall silent. Sometimes the final chapter is written months later in quiet courtyards far from the battlefield. It is there, away from artillery and charging armies, that history decides whether justice will follow the violence of war. In December of 1945, 6 months after the surrender of Nazi Germany, one such moment unfolded in a quiet military compound in southern Italy. It would become one of the earliest and clearest warnings the post-war world would receive. Obedience to evil would no longer be accepted as an excuse, and one German general was about to learn that lesson the hardest way possible. Frozen Courtyard, December 1st, 1945, Aversa, Italy. The execution ground was cold and thick with mud. Winter air hung heavy, each breath turning to frost. The war in Europe had already been over for half a year. German armies had collapsed, their soldiers disarmed and held in prisoner camps while the long process of accounting began. The killing was supposed to be finished, but on that bitter morning, a final act of violent justice remained. Bound tightly to a wooden post stood a man still wearing his Wehrmacht uniform. His breath steamed in the icy air. This was no ordinary soldier awaiting punishment. He was not a private. He was not a sergeant. He was a general of the German infantry. For years, this man had commanded tens of thousands of troops across the battlefields of Europe. He had lived with the quiet assumption that rank insulated men like him from the consequences that fell on lesser soldiers. His name was General Anton Dostler. Only days earlier, Dostler had been fighting desperately, not on a battlefield, but in a courtroom. Standing before an American military tribunal, he had presented his defense, and his appeals had moved through every available channel, reaching ultimately to the desk of the Supreme Allied Commander himself, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dostler's defense rested on an argument that would become painfully familiar in the years of trials that followed. The same reasoning countless German officers would offer when the war turned against them. He had been following orders. He believed, by most accounts of those who observed him during the proceedings, that his rank would carry weight, that the Americans would extend professional consideration to a fellow general, that Eisenhower, a man known for measured judgment, would spare him. Generals, in his understanding of the world, did not execute other generals. He was about to discover how completely that world had changed. To Eisenhower's decision. When Dostler's appeal for clemency reached Eisenhower, the Allied commander reviewed the case. The answer came back without equivocation. There would be no prison sentence, no quiet arrangement, no mercy extended on the grounds of rank or shared profession. The order confirming the tribunal's judgment moved through the chain of command. The execution would proceed. But to understand why Eisenhower, a man who genuinely despised unnecessary bloodshed, refused to intervene, it is necessary to travel back nearly 2 years, because the events that sealed Dostler's fate had taken place long before that winter morning in Aversa. Operation Ginny, March 1944. Deep behind German lines in occupied northern Italy, 15 American soldiers moved quietly along a rocky stretch of coastline. They were part of a covert sabotage mission, Operation Ginny II, assigned a dangerous but entirely lawful military objective: destroy a key railway tunnel supplying German forces in the region. These men were not spies operating in disguise. They wore the uniforms of the United States Army. Under the laws and customs of war as understood at the time, they were combatants entitled to the protections that uniformed soldiers were afforded upon capture. But the mission unraveled. The commandos were discovered, captured by Italian fascist forces, and handed over to German troops. Those troops belonged to the 75th Army Corps, commanded by General Anton Dostler. The requirements under international law were not ambiguous. Uniformed soldiers who had surrendered were prisoners of war. They were to be held, protected, and eventually repatriated when the conflict ended. When the matter reached Dostler's headquarters, the general turned instead to a directive that had been circulating through the German command structure since October 1942. The Commando order, issued personally by Adolf Hitler. Its instruction was stark. Allied commando forces captured behind German lines were to be executed immediately, regardless of whether they wore proper military uniforms or had surrendered. By accounts preserved in the subsequent trial record, at least one of Dostler's subordinate officers raised objections. The captured men were American soldiers. Executing them would constitute a war crime. The warning, according to testimony, was ignored. Dostler ordered the executions to proceed. And the execution. The 15 Americans were marched to a remote coastal area. They were given no trial, no opportunity to write home, no formal process of any kind. They were lined up and shot. Their bodies were placed in a shallow grave along the Italian coast, hidden from view. It was the kind of act designed to disappear quietly into the vast machinery of wartime killing. One more entry that would never find its way into any report. Dostler returned to his duties. As far as he was concerned, the matter was closed. 15 lives taken, no witnesses who would speak, no consequences waiting on the other side of the war. But history has a particular way of catching up with men who believe themselves permanently beyond accountability. War changes men. By 1945, the war had changed nearly everything, and it had changed Dwight D. Eisenhower. In the early years of the conflict, Eisenhower had been primarily a strategist. His war was fought at planning tables, over maps where armies moved as symbols across vast distances. The enemy was an abstraction, a force to be countered, outmaneuvered, defeated. That changed in the spring of 1945. As Allied forces pushed into Germany, they began liberating what they found inside the concentration camps. Ohrdruf, Buchenwald, Dachau. Eisenhower visited Ohrdruf personally on April 12, 1945, accompanied by Generals Patton and Bradley. What he encountered there was not the abstraction of war. It was its full reality. Accounts from those present describe him moving through the camp in silence, past stacked bodies, past survivors too weakened to stand. Patton, by his own account, became physically ill and refused to enter one of the buildings. Eisenhower went through everything, deliberately, forcing himself to see it completely. He later wrote that he wanted to be able to give first-hand testimony if anyone ever attempted to claim that what happened there had not happened at all. He had believed he was fighting an enemy army. After that day, he understood something larger and darker. He was fighting a system that had been built on the willingness of ordinary men to silence their own judgment and carry out whatever was demanded of them. Men who shot prisoners, who ran camps, who processed the paperwork of atrocity and went home in the evening. Men who would later say they had simply been following orders. Eisenhower made no theatrical declaration about what he intended, but those who knew him described something in him that had permanently hardened. The era of professional courtesies extended across enemy lines had limits he had not previously needed to define. Now those limits were defined. Unexpected arrest. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, General Anton Dostler fell into American hands. By most accounts of his behavior in the early weeks of captivity, he did not appear unduly concerned. German officers of his rank were being questioned about military operations. Most expected detention of some duration followed eventually by repatriation. Dostler appears to have expected something similar. What he did not know was that American investigators, working through the chaos of liberated Italy, had located a shallow grave along the coastline. The bodies of 15 American soldiers, still identifiable as such, had been found. The investigation that followed moved quickly. When investigators entered Dostler's cell and presented him with formal charges of war crimes, accounts from those present describe his reaction as one of stunned indignation as much as fear. He was a general of infantry, he reportedly insisted. He could not be treated as a common criminal. The evidence told a different story. The defense. The trial was held in Rome in the autumn of 1945, making it among the earliest formal war crimes proceedings of the post-war period. Dostler sat through the proceedings with the bearing of a man who had not fully accepted where he was. His defense rested entirely on the Führerbefehl, Hitler's direct order. His attorneys argued that a soldier who had disobeyed would have faced court-martial or worse. He had been given a command by the head of state. To expect him to refuse it was to misunderstand the realities of military service. It was not an argument without tactical logic. If accepted, it would have created a template under which almost any atrocity committed within the German chain of command could be attributed upward to Hitler and effectively excused. The American tribunal rejected it. The distinction the judges drew was one that would echo through the decades of trials that followed. A soldier is bound to obey lawful orders. An order to execute unarmed prisoners of war is not a lawful order. It is an order to commit murder. The existence of a superior who issued that order does not transfer the criminal responsibility away from the man who carried it out. Dostler had received warnings from his own subordinates. He had chosen to proceed. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death by firing squad. By accounts of those present in the courtroom, The confidence Dostler had maintained through much of the proceedings cracked visibly when the sentence was read. The reality that had perhaps remained abstract until that moment became suddenly entirely concrete. He was going to be executed. The final appeal. His lawyers moved immediately. Appeals went to the highest levels of Allied command, framing the case in strategic terms. Executing a German general, they argued, would set a precedent that complicated the path toward post-war reconciliation. Life imprisonment, they suggested, would constitute sufficient punishment while avoiding the irreversibility of an execution. The appeal reached Eisenhower. For a commander of his position, the decision carried weight beyond the individual case. Showing clemency to a convicted officer would have been, in strictly diplomatic terms, a defensible choice. Reducing a death sentence to imprisonment was not without precedent, but Eisenhower was not approaching this as a diplomatic question. He was thinking about 15 American soldiers lined up against a cliff on the Italian coast. He was thinking about the families who had received the telegrams. He was thinking about what he had walked through at Ohrdruf. Eisenhower approved the execution, confirming the tribunal's sentence. He stated plainly that allowing a general officer to escape the punishment of death after ordering the execution of prisoners would be a mockery of justice. The appeal was denied. The Firing Squad. December 1st, 1945. Aversa, Italy. Morning fog clung low over the courtyard. The winter air was sharp and still. At 8 o'clock in the morning, General Anton Dostler was escorted from his cell. He wore his Wehrmacht uniform, though all insignia had been removed. His hands were bound behind his back. By accounts from those present, the bearing that had defined him through the trial had given way to something quieter and more diminished. He was brought to a wooden post set into the muddy ground of the courtyard. 20 paces away, 12 American soldiers stood in formation, each holding an M1 Garand rifle. A chaplain offered a brief prayer. Dostler responded in a low voice. A black hood was lowered over his head. Silence settled across the courtyard. Only the wind moved. What passed through his mind in those final seconds beneath the hood, history cannot say with certainty. Whether he thought of the 15 men he had condemned, or of the cliff where they had died, or whether he still believed even then that he had done nothing beyond his duty, that remains unknown. The command was given. 12 rifles fired together. It was over within seconds. General Anton Dostler, among the first German generals executed for war crimes after the Second World War, was dead. Message to history. News of the execution circulated among captured German officers and military circles. Until that morning, many senior officers had maintained a quiet assumption that rank would provide a kind of buffer, that the Americans, in the end, would observe the unspoken conventions that had historically governed the treatment of defeated commanders, that the worst outcome would be a period of captivity before an eventual return to private life. Aversa answered that assumption directly. The message that Eisenhower's decision carried was not complicated. A uniform does not grant the right to murder prisoners. Rank does not place a man above the reach of justice. And an order, however it arrives, from however high in a chain of command, does not absolve the man who chooses to carry it out. The trials that followed at Nuremberg and across the occupied zones of Germany would develop these principles at length in proceedings that lasted years and examined crimes of staggering scale. But Dostler's case, decided quickly and quietly in Rome in the autumn of 1945, had already established the essential point before Nuremberg opened its doors. Eisenhower was known, by those who served under him, as a man who preferred resolution to confrontation and consensus to conflict. He was not, by temperament, a man who reached easily for the harshest available response, but he understood something about the peace he was trying to build. A peace constructed without accountability for what had been done inside it was not really peace. It was silence arranged to look like peace, and silence of that kind had a way of becoming permission. Permission for the next man, in the next war, to calculate that if he kept his head down and followed his orders, history would eventually pass him by without stopping. Eisenhower stopped. He made the calculation that accountability, even when uncomfortable, even when irreversible, was the only foundation on which anything lasting could be built. Sometimes justice arrives in a frozen courtyard, carried by 12 rifles, in the early morning silence of a world still learning what it means to hold itself responsible.